Chapter 6, the levee. At 9 o'clock, the chamberlain came to tap at the door to announce the levee. As soon as the emperor had finished the reading or the work he was engaged in, he went into the sitting room. There, the principal heads of staff of the household were gathered to receive their orders. The ministers who had some urgent communication to make to the emperor took advantage of the hour of the levee to speak to him. And the chief of police was always there. They also used this time to introduce the principal functionaries of their departments, who came to Paris and whom the emperor wished to see. In general, all those who had entree could appear before Napoleon at this time. When the servants had been dismissed, the emperor detained those persons with whom he needed to speak, and it was not unusual that these audiences following the levee were prolonged until lunchtime. But if preoccupied, he did not see in the circle of his assistants any who had reason to keep him there. He hastened to return to his cabinet and pick up his work where he had left off. In this case, the levee sometimes lasted not even 5 minutes. There was a small levee and a great levee. The small was that of every day, of which we have just spoken. It comprised only the servants and those who had entree to conduct business. The great levee was held on Thursdays. Everyone made a point of coming to pay court, and the emperor always found many people there to speak to. Chapter 7, Luncheon. Lunchtime belonged to the family circle. This hour that Napoleon spent with his wife and son had its purpose as well, like all others. But the private audiences and the conversations that the emperor reserved for this moment were of such a nature that the empress could take part in them with some interest. It was usually during lunch that the emperor received his architect, Fontaine, the museum director, Monsieur Tenon, and his librarian, Monsieur Barbier. It was also at this time that he admitted, though less frequently, the official painter David and some of the more distinguished artists whose conversation he enjoyed, sometimes Girard, the painter, or Chaudet, the sculptor, sometimes the actor Talma. I must not forget Isabelle, who held the title of painter of the imperial household and who gave lessons to the empress. But I return to the librarian, and on this occasion we'll make a side trip to the library, which was a natural extension of the cabinet. The librarian was admitted at least once a week. He came to report on literary news, bringing books that the authors had requested him to present, and he took the emperor's orders for work in and acquisitions to the library. I can see the good and modest Barbier in brown court dress with buttons of gold and steel, his frizzled hair powdered and tied back, wearing a jabot, lace cuffs, and a sword at his side, coming forward with his hat under his arm, followed by a large basket containing the books. At the initial greeting, he embarrasses himself by getting the end of his sword stuck in the wicker of the basket, but is soon put at ease by the emperor's warm welcome, responding to the literary conversation in progress, turning back and forth between the basket to pull out books and the emperor to give them to him, and in his actions as well as in the tenor of his speech, providing the most complete contrast between his manner and his dress. This excellent man was the emperor's librarian only after 1807. His predecessor was Monsieur Ripaut, librarian of the Institute of Cairo, who had come to the Tuileries at the time of the return from Egypt. Monsieur Ripaut, a kind, gentle, well-educated man who had published a philosophical history of Marcus Aurelius in 4 volumes, was at that time the favorite librarian at Malmaison. But little by little he fell from the favor he owed as much to personal esteem as to Memoirs of Egypt. The title of second librarian had been accorded to the priest Denina, author of History of the Italian Revolutions. This was a purely honorary edition, yet it was after this appointment that Monsieur Ripoll seemed to take a dislike to his work. Perhaps, too, it was the state of his health and the demands of his studies to which he succumbed. Whatever the reason, he had been living in retirement for more than a year in his home at La Chapelle, near Orléans, when the emperor decided to replace him. Monsieur Barbier had first made a name for himself through his exceptional work with books on the different conservation committees he had been in charge of at the time of the revolution. It was due to him that the first libraries were pulled from the chaos. The executive director had entrusted him with the duty of creating his personal library, and he had created others as well. His dictionary of pseudonyms and anonymous writers had just placed him in the forefront of our bibliographers. Additionally, he had been librarian to the Council of State since its creation. The secretary of the portfolio, Meneval, opportunely recalled having worked with librarians under Monsieur Barbier in his early youth. It was on this recommendation that the emperor took this man as librarian. He could not have made a better choice. Barbier was a library specialist. He hastened to establish them at Saint-Cloud, Fontainebleau, Compiègne, Rambouillet, and even the Trianon. Everywhere that the court needed this distraction to the idleness that dragged with it. The particular post of librarian with the emperor was not without importance. If authors in sending their books accompanied them with letters or memoranda, it was ordinarily the librarian who reported on them. Between his books and the emperor, Barbier was not only useful, he was instructive. Everything he brought became the subject of interesting conversation, and pursuant to controversial questions, the emperor plied him with various literary and scientific requests, pleased to take advantage of his erudition and experience. Sometimes it was Velly's History of France to be continued. Sometimes it was Greek or Latin authors who had not been translated or whose translations were so ancient that they needed to be replaced by versions that had been brought up to date. Sometimes it was research on the liberties of the Gallican Church, on emperors who had suspended or deposed popes, or on the Templars. Sometimes it was a report on the printer Bodini, or on Visconti's iconography, and sometimes, finally, it was a review of all the useful work still lacking for the needs of science, as the emperor put the public interest above everything. One day, Barbier gave him a copy of Pilpay's Fables, printed in Persian in Calcutta in 1805. The emperor did not wish this unusual work to remain in obscurity in his home, so it was taken to the great library in the Rue de Richelieu. In this national treasury, he placed all he found that was exceptionally rare or beautiful. On another occasion, he had a copy of the Iliad in Greek, printed on vellum by Bodini, taken there. At this time, we had in Paris the trial of Galilee, the documents having been brought from Rome. The emperor planned to have them printed, but there wasn't time, and the Vatican was able to reclaim the manuscript. In the various chateaus where the court sojourned, the librarian came to work with the emperor. During these long absences from Paris, he continued nevertheless to keep abreast of literary news. He invariably sent the emperor everything notable that appeared and almost always forwarded a short literary bulletin via Meneval. The emperor had long wanted to have a portable library constructed especially for his use. If the reader would be curious to see him in the midst of his books, to know the importance he granted to each type of literature and the system he had set up for his everyday library, it will be interesting to read the two following letters that he dictated to Meneval to be written to the librarian Barbier. Here we find the outline of a portable library, described two different ways, a year apart. Bayonne. July 17th, 1808. The emperor wishes to put together a small portable library of 1,000 small in 12 volumes printed in beautiful type. His Majesty's intention is to have these works printed for his personal use without margins in order to save space. The volumes would be from 5 to 600 pages, bound with the spines broken and detached, and the thinnest possible covers. This would be roughly the composition of the library: 40 volumes of religion, 40 of the epics, 40 of drama, 60 volumes of poetry, 100 novels, 60 volumes of history. The difference to make up 1,000 would be historical memoirs from all eras. The religious works would be the Old and New Testaments, taking the best translations, some of the apostles, and the other most important works of the Church Fathers. The Quran, mythology, dissertations chosen on the different sects that have had the most influence in history, such as the Arians, Calvinists, Protestants, etc., and a history of the Roman Catholic Church, if it can be included in the recommended number of volumes. The epics would be Homer, Lucan, Tasso, Telemachus, Henrietta, etc. The tragedies, Racine's work, except for Le Frères Ennemis, Alexandre and Les Plaideurs of Crébillon. Take only Ramadista, Atre, and Theist. The remaining volumes should be of Voltaire. After that, include Corneille's work for the rest. History selects some of the good works of chronology, the major ones of ancient times, and that which outlines in detail the history of France. History can include Machiavelli's discourses, the spirit of the laws, the grandeur of the Romans, and what is suitable to keep of Voltaire's history. The novels, Eloisa and Rousseau's Confessions. We need not make mention of the masterpieces of Fielding, Richardson, Lesage, etc., which naturally find their place here. Voltaire's stories. Note, do not include either Rousseau's Emile or a stack of useless letters, memoirs, speeches, and dissertations. The same applies to Voltaire. The emperor wishes to have a descriptive catalog with notes regarding the finest works and a memo on what these 1,000 volumes cost to be printed and bound, which volume contains which works of which author, how much each weighs, how many packing boxes they require, and what dimension, and the total space that occupies. The emperor also wishes Monsieur Barbier to take care of the following matter with one of our best geographers. Write up reports of the campaigns which took place on the Euphrates against the Parthians, from that of Crassus up to the 18th century, including those of Antony, Trajan, Julian, etc. Trace on maps of a suitable size the route that each army followed, with the ancient and modern names of countries and principal cities, geographic observations on the territory, and historical accounts of each expedition taken from the original authors. Signed, Meneval. June 12, 1809, Schönbrunn. The emperor daily feels the need for a travel library composed of historical works. His Majesty wishes to increase the number of volumes in this library to 3,000, all of in 18 format like the Dauphin's in 18 collection, having 400 to 500 pages each and printed in Dito's beautiful type on thin vellum paper. The in 12 format takes up too much space, and in any case, the works printed in this format are almost all poor editions. The 3,000 volumes would be placed in 30 packing boxes having 3 rows, each row holding 33 volumes. This collection is to have a common title and numbering system, regardless of the title of the work itself. It can be divided into 5 or 6 categories. 1. World history and chronology. 2. Ancient history in the original and ancient history written in modern dates. 3. History of the Byzantine Empire in the original and the modern. 4. General and specific history, like Voltaire's essay. 5. modern history of the European states, France, Italy, etc., it must include Strabo, the old maps of Danville, the Bible, and a history of the church. This is the framework for the 5 or 6 categories which must be studied and filled with care. A certain number of men of letters are needed, men of taste, to be in charge of rereading these editions, correcting them, deleting all that is unimportant, such as editor's notes or any Greek or Latin text. Keep only the French translation. Only some Italian works which have no translation may be kept in Italian. The emperor begs Monsieur Barbier to draw up plans for this library and to let him know the most advantageous and economic manner of having these 3,000 volumes made. When these 3,000 volumes of history have been completed, there will be followed by 3,000 others of natural history, travel, literature, etc. The majority of these will be easy to collect, as many are already found in 18. Monsieur Barbier is also asked to send a list of these works with clear and detailed notes on all of this. The men of letters who could be put in charge, an estimate of the time and the expense, etc. Signed Meneval. This plan for a portable was never realized. The librarian was diligent, but events had exceeded his zeal. Chapter 8. Continuation of the day's work in the inner cabinet. The record books. On returning to his cabinet, the emperor found his table put back in order and cleared of papers no longer in use. After the day's correspondence came the turn of the various files kept to one side. The emperor could be seen moving from one to the next, dictating the outline of a diplomatic note, critically examining a plan for fortifications, drawing up a training regimen for a new army corps, sowing the basis for a discussion of civil rights, inspecting a statement of receipts or expenses from the treasury, calculating the progression of naval construction in a given time, relaxing a moment over the artillery reports, which always gave him pleasure to see, as they reminded him of his youth, turning from arsenals to road construction, berating the civil engineering department for its slowness, questioning the customs balance, settling his household affairs, and looking over his treasurer's accounts, all of it with a masterful eye. How many different subjects the secretary's mind had to encompass during this long morning's journey. Familiarity eased the abruptness of the transitions. Continually challenged to think along with the emperor, we became familiar with all his digressions and knew very well how to make use of a limitless number of practicable documents which served as instruments in his work, because Napoleon's cabinet was a laboratory with a mechanical facet to it. He himself said, the craft of emperor has its tools like all others. Napoleon's memory was prodigious, but what human memory could have been adequate in a position like his? He had provided for this by methods that he took pains to have practiced around him. His ministers and his principal officers were obliged to abandon their personal systems of work and organization to adopt his. In conducting affairs with the emperor, one spoke only his language. Cogwheels were only to travel in the grooves that he himself established. Each compartment of his memory had its counterpart in a record book, and he excelled at availing himself of this resource. His desk became a veritable keyboard where the strings of government ended, and only he, along with his secretary, made vibrate those that it pleased him to touch. In all lines of work, there are tools of the trade. The throne, too, had its workshop. If I someday have the honor of being read by a prince called upon to rule, it seems to me he would say, you cannot err by giving too many details. We want to know all there is to know of the internal procedures of Napoleon that he made use of in governing. His methods are the fundamental skills of princes. Encouraged by this illusion, my memory awakens. I return to the past in my mind's eye, and I enter the cabinet. My imagination finds everything in the place where I left it. I myself am back at my table. I scan that which presents itself to my sight, And first, the pile which dominates the corner of the emperor's desk stubbornly draws my attention. Will the reader follow me into this arsenal of information? Each minister provided record books drawn up according to the examples that Napoleon himself had created. Nothing was to be changed in the format or the arrangement of subjects, except by his order. He had to know better than anyone what was found there, and he could consult them with his eyes closed. Every 2 weeks or every month at the latest, the record books were exchanged and replaced by others which in the meantime had been brought up to date. I would have difficulty recalling the complete list. I will attempt at least to give an idea of the principal ones. War records. The record books of this ministry were the most numerous. Each regiment appeared in the book in numerical order. Each had its own page, and in the columns subdividing it were found the names of the colonel, major, and other superior officers. A list of the occasions when the regiment had distinguished itself, in which army and which active division each war battalion had been deployed, the location assigned to the depot, the strength of the regiment overall, and in men present at arms, a list of the sick and injured in the hospitals, the shortfall to a full complement, the number of records assigned to the regiment out of that year's draft, and lastly, the listing of the counties where the recruits came from. You can see that this record book provided a brief survey of each corps taken singly. All the scattered branches of the service came together in this common framework to represent the whole of the military family. Another record book was that of military divisions. Here, the point of view was local. Each military division composed its own landscape. The first began the book and the last ended it. The listings gave the name of the commanding general, that of his chief of staff, his aides de camp, and the brigade generals, the superior officers, and regional commanders he had under him. They also told which troops were deployed in this geographical area, distinguishing those that were mobile and available from those that were not. In the particulars was found the most precise information on the regiments and partial regiments, the companies of sappers and mine layers, the artillery troops, the equipment squadrons, the battalions of veterans, the departmental companies, the garrisons of the location, and the arsenals. In a word, all the elements of the military forces dispersed in this division. A recap of the whole to complete the landscape. Further, the record book by Army Corps offered another mirror. There the troops were identified, counted, and subdivided into their camps. First, there was the headquarters where the staff personnel and the heads of various departments of the military administration. Then came each division with the regiments grouped by brigade. In this configuration, the eye could easily see the names of generals and colonels, the list of sites, the number of corps, the strength of the division in men, horses, and artillery, with a notation indicating the reinforcements that were en route to join them. Finally, after the active divisions came the garrisons, arsenals, and all the supplementary branches of the army. Each week the minister submitted a sheet on which was written all the marching orders he had given. That was the list of troop movements. The day of departure and arrival were carefully calculated there. A deployment chart by columns followed each troop day by day over the terrain they had to cover. Each evening the emperor could see where the smallest detachment was sleeping on each leg of the journey. In the personnel record book, like in common portrait gallery, were found all the generals, from the most famous to the most obscure. A record of military duties formed the basis of these entries. One could see there by which campaigns, which armies, which sections each had advanced. Age, wounds, current position, period of retirement were noted there. Let us hasten to add that this book consisted only of names, ranks, and military information. Artillery and engineering had a separate record book, and all that information was organized in a manner similar to what we have just seen. Napoleon's consistency of method and simplicity of organization were remarkable. The same procedure served for all uses, like a master key that opens all locks. Lastly, there was a record book wherein the operations of raising troops were listed by county. This was the prefix black book. The tally of late arrivals and deserters formed a sort of political thermometer, records of foreign armies. It was much, but not enough for the emperor to have on corner of his desk all his army arranged in good order, generals at the head. He was eager to place alongside it the European armies, which could become its allies or its enemies. So the Minister of Foreign Relations had record books to keep current also. This second collection was drawn up along the same lines and with the same information as that of the French army, and the emperor read it just as easily. But in lieu of precise figures, he only saw probable figures. For them to be more certain and exact would have required bribery, and Napoleon would have been ashamed to resort to such methods. He would have considered it a sign of weakness, and it was said that It was said that more than one foreign minister had offered to place himself at Napoleon's disposal in this regard. I don't know whether that is true, but even if he could have done this, at any rate he didn't. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps in politics one must seize on all human failings, and we would agree that in this sense the emperor was not the best politician of his time. In any case, all the legations that the empire maintained abroad had secret instructions to keep continuous notes on all troop movements that passed before their eyes or came to their knowledge. The names of generals or commanding officers, the names or numbers of regiments, their estimated strength, the country they left, or the one they were going to. Such were the principal pieces of information to note. Nothing must be neglected, not even that which was found in the newspapers with some authenticity. This information was the subject of a separate report, and the ministry in Paris had an office in charge of studying it. Among these various particulars arriving from completely different sources, successive connections were made. With highly concentrated attention, they were compared, verified, and completed. Approximate results were obtained at first, then refined. The emperor, already so skilled at judging the true strength of course, following the probabilities of military organization, in the long run obtained rough data on all the armies in Europe, which was sufficient for most calculations. Often, the fortunes of war provided him with the opportunity to find out how exact his foreign records were. Any information that the interrogation of prisoners or deserters could produce was quickly gathered to act as a control on the record books, and nearly every test proved the work done in Paris to France's advantage. In Russia, the Cossacks robbed us of the carriage containing our records of their army. The enemy recognized the accuracy of this information to the point where they believed we had stolen it from them, and was naive enough to reproach us for this in publications of the era. Nothing proves better the skill with which our Statistics Bureau had accurately hit the truth. Navy records. This, for the emperor, was the book of the future, and he consulted it often. In the first section, ships were classified according to their construction. Vessels with 3 decks, frigates, brigantines, avisos, prams, flotilla, ships, etc. Each ship had its own record containing the date of construction, which is to say its age, the number of cannons, the commander's name, and the number of the crew, the station, cruise, expedition, squadron, port, or shipyard where it was found. If the ship was in port, you could tell at a glance the state of its arms and its supplies. If it was in the shipyard, the progress of its construction or repair. The second section of the book grouped the whole of the Navy by maritime prefectures or by large seaports and squadrons. The record on Brest, for example, would name the maritime prefect, the vice admirals, the rear admirals, who, through duty or through circumstance, lived in this port or stayed there. Next came the vessels in their varying degrees of availability, to wit, ships in harbor, those outbound, armed, unarmed, in the shipyard for repair, and lastly, in the stocks under construction. Progress in construction was specified by fractional figures indicating whether the ship was in a quarter built, a third, half, etc. The list of record books is becoming too lengthy. I feel that I must abridge it, and yet I must say a word about the finance records. finance records. The object of these records was to keep the emperor up to date on the condition of each fund, each expenditure, and each account. Here he could see the resources a certain branch of the government had left, the debts that a certain expense had incurred, the funds that a certain account was to receive during the month, and the payments that it had to make. It was amazing how quickly he could discern in these cramped lines what was truly important. One day, in the course of work, his fingers stopped at an entry of 60,000 francs paid to a regiment in Paris. He pointed it out to a minister. "You say this payment was made in Paris?" "No doubt." "The document bears this out?" "Certainly." "But it is absurd. The detachment is 100 leagues from here. Look closely. This is a huge fraud." The minister could not fail to recognize it. It was, in fact, a bold deception committed with the help of printed forms, to which he had been added perfectly forged signatures. The public revenue lists showed him monthly payments. This way, he was in a position to know how the budget predictions turned out, if receipts were suffering in some areas and if others could compensate for them. The financial state of the coffers and holdings was given to him no less exactly. The money which was to pay that month's expenses was counted out under his eyes, so to speak. Had the funds been insufficient, he himself could have indicated to the treasurer which holdings to liquidate. Briefly put, he was always in command of the smallest transactions in the treasury. He followed them, and few bankers know their figures better than he did his. From the order established at the outset in financial accountability, Napoleon wished that an ordinary individual, divorced from all administrative information and with the sole help of the minister's stated accounts, be able to easily follow all the major transactions and results of the empire's financial operations. What Napoleon wanted was obtained. Only this admirable organization and accounting, and above all the care that the emperor himself knew to balance his receipts and his expenses, explain how so many payments were made in all branches of government with such unvarying regularity and without new taxes, loans, or advances in the midst of perpetual wars. Market prices. For the emperor, the price of wheat was an economic indicator which he often watched. To sort out with a glance all the figures which normally make the condition of market prices awkward to compare, he had printed a small map of France where each county was represented by a square. Within each square was written the local price of wheat, according to the latest figures. A coat of 5 colors divided this map into 5 regions: the south, north, east, west, and center. The color referred to a key in the margin indicating the maximum, minimum, and average prices in the region. Lastly, in a 2-line summary at the bottom of the page were found the average price for all of France and the 2 counties representing the 2 extremes, the highest and the lowest price. This way, not only did the emperor know every 2 weeks the variations in wheat prices in every corner of France in a most obvious manner, but with the same glance he learned where there were insufficiencies or overabundances, and at once saw what it was necessary to do to help restore equilibrium. You can now see how the emperor from inside his cabinet was able to take care of so many different things and at the same time to be so meticulous, so exact, and yet so rapid. With such a store of information in his head, in his hands, he was never caught unawares. On the contrary, he was well ahead of his entourage in every respect and at all times. If someone spoke in the council or before him of the need to send troops to a place in the interior where disturbances were feared, immediately after having glanced at his record book, he himself informed the minister of war of what troops were the nearest and to which generals orders were to be sent. Should a greater show of force become necessary, he found on his sheet the movement of the troops on the march who were in the vicinity at that time and had them make a detour. The orders were given by his dictation and without a pause. In times of emergency, if one minister's calculations carried the drawback of not having been combined with another's, the emperor was able to supply the necessary information and did so at once. Passing a corps of troops in review, he knew how to approach personal matters he wished to refer to the general or colonel. If he paused before veteran soldiers, he knew which battles and which campaigns to speak of to them. If he wanted to make young conscripts smile, he had on his lips the name of the town where they had been born. If a marshal wrongly complained of not having enough men, the emperor wrote to him time after time to remind him of what resources he had neglected, what corps he had forgotten, and what reinforcements the minister had already told him were on the way. On arriving at a fortified town, he knew better than the commander what there was by way of munitions, what different sorts of artillery could be found on the ramparts and in the magazines, the hundredweights of powder, the caliber of the bullets, the unmounted guns, etc. If a prefect spoke to him of the draft, he knew better than the prefect the number of deserters in the least contingent. If he went to visit public works, he calculated for the engineer the funds already spent, and from the expenses knew how to judge the work. If he gave audience to a foreign ambassador, he sometimes amused himself by telling him the number of the most recent regiments his sovereign had created, or which troops formed a new cordon in his country along a certain border. These feats of genius will find fewer admirers now that some of the resources enabling him to produce them are known, but they will also meet with less skepticism. At the time, prestige carried extraordinary power, and very few people, even those closest to Napoleon in his entourage, had an accurate idea not only of all the facilities he had to learn things for himself, but yet of the skill with which he knew how to create means of surveillance and control for his work that were unique to him. As for myself, when the emperor began to leaf through the papers on his table, I thought I saw opening there in the cabinet as many windows as a magic lantern, and it seemed to me that the inner workings of no office escaped his scrutiny. Chapter 9. The end of the day in the cabinet. All the hours spent in the solitude of the cabinet were not devoted solely to general affairs. Some were kept for diversions, or rather those particular tasks which took the place of diversions. The extraordinary domain was perhaps the largest part of the personal affairs that the emperor concluded, and what an immense resource it was. At the same time that Napoleon drew from exceptional political gifts, he piled up resources there whose secrets remained with him alone. He had not placed this reserve under any minister's care, but gave it a separate administration under the direction of Count de Fermont, a separate treasury and portfolio in Baron de la Bouilliere's care, and a separate accounting performed in the cabinet under his eyes and by me. My work was divided between two large books he always kept on a corner of his table: the list of holdings and the list of individuals. The list of holdings contained the gross total worth in land and revenues attributed to the extraordinary domain of Pomerania, Poland, Bayreuth, Hanover, Westphalia, and now the counties between the Meuse and the Rhine, Dutch Brabant, Belgium, the Roman counties, Parma, Plaisance, Illyria, the French canals, the tolls in the Rhine, Mount Milan, and the Great Book of France. Next to the gross worth, the concessions deducted off the top were noted exactly, and what was left in available net worth appeared. The list of individuals was a sort of dictionary of grants. An account had been opened for each recipient and indicated that there was not only the income that had been granted to him, but also the holdings from which this income had been derived. When the emperor wanted to grant endowments, he calculated them himself, having in front of him the amounts he had already given.